Welcome, everyone. We will just begin in just a few minutes. I just want to proceed by thanking everyone for joining us to the fourth event in the Psychology Department series, What's My Lab Do? Okay. Jose and I are two of the peer advisors here to present one of our distinguished faculty members today. Before we get started, we wanted to go over a few things.
So you're our peer advisor, college partner.
You're on.
Hello, everyone. So we are peer advisors along with Krisa, Leanne, and Rebecca. And a little bit about what we do at the psychology department. As peer advisors, we can help students make or update personal academic plans to help them know which major requirements have been completed and which requirements are still needed. We are also available to make graduation checks to make sure students who are nearing their graduation term have met all major requirements. We can also assist with major declaration questions / concerns or general questions about the different psychology majors or just general advice. So feel free to join us for drop-in hours or email us at psychpeer@ucsc.edu with any questions you may have. So without further ado, I want to give a warm introduction to Dr. Adriana Manago. Today, she has joined us to discuss what it's like to be part of a research lab and her work within the Culture and Tech Lab. So thank you so much for joining us today, Professor Manago. We're excited to learn more about your work.
Great, thanks so much for having me here. I'm excited to share with you a little bit about what's happening in our lab and yeah, what it's like to participate in the research lab. Everyone can see my slides, right? What's my lab do?
Yeah.
Oh, great. Okay, yeah, so I'm Dr. Adriana Manago. I'm the director of the Culture and Technology Lab, the CAT Lab for short. My website here if you'd like to check out more information. So yeah, let's start off with who's in the lab. Right now, the Culture and Tech Lab, the CAT Lab, is primarily the three of us, me and my two graduate students, Zach Keith and Karina Nazario. And they are working, so Zach is primarily focused on what they call cyberqueer adolescent identity development, with this idea that we're in a new kind of generational cohort with LGBTQ adolescents being exquisitely digitally connected. And so there's a different kind of cultural process that's happening with gender and sexuality development. And that's what Zach is studying. And Zach has some undergraduates, Gabby Garcia, Hannah Greenstein, Austin Dominguez, and Vic Reynoso. And Karina Nazario is studying social media and civic identity development. So she's thinking about Generation Z growing up with social media and developing sort of like their political identities, their understanding of society and inequalities, and what's happening at the societal level, their civic identity development in the context of social media. And the undergraduates that she's working with is Jackie Gonzalez, Sierra Donahue, and Natalie Kwan. So usually what happens is every week we get together as a community. We have lab meetings once a week on Fridays. Graduate students and undergraduates are invited to come. We also sometimes get graduate students from different labs who want to come visit. So I have graduate students sometimes from Margarita Esmitia's lab, or from Cam Leeper's lab, or Phil Hammock's lab that kind of pop in. We have overlapping interests in, say, gender or social media. And so we have lots of visitors as well to our weekly lab meetings. And weekly lab meetings are an opportunity for us to share work in progress, to sort of build community, to read some recent articles that are relevant to our work, to practice presentations, for example. So it's just a community workspace event that happens every week. So what does my lab do? So we're in a really unique and important position, right? A lot of people are talking about social media, and there's a lot of concerns that social media are bad for adolescent development. So I get a lot of questions when people find out that I study adolescent identity development and social media. They often want to know, is social media toxic for kids? Is it interrupting their development? So there's been some, it's been all over the news recently in the past couple of weeks. Jonathan Haidt has some new research suggesting that there's been an uptick in teen mental health issues right around 2012. 2012 is when smartphones really started to become mainstream. And so that's been in the news quite a bit about blaming technology for teen mental health issues. Last year, or a year and a half ago or so, there was a whistleblower, Frances Haugen, if you remember that news piece, where she had worked for Facebook, and she testified before Congress that Facebook knows that Instagram is toxic for teen girls' mental health. Documents show this, and she was widely praised and covered throughout the media. Both Republican and Democratic senators were really praising her testimony. It's the first time Democrats and Republicans ever agreed. And so one of the reasons why these kinds of stories really get widespread and why they're so compelling to all of us is because they resonate with what we call techno-panic narratives. So what are techno-panic narratives? Techno-panic narratives are these stories, these sort of frameworks by which we understand social media, and it's a very deterministic way of understanding social media. So when I say deterministic, it's this idea that technology is determining something about humans. So technology is harming adolescents. Instagram is toxic. So techno-panic narratives are accounts of social media and adolescent development in which adolescents, especially white girls, we often see that white girls that are portrayed as the victims here, are portrayed as victims of technology. And the idea of techno-panic narratives is an important part of them is that they aim to restrict youth access to social media by expressing cultural beliefs and values about what adolescents should be like, what they should become, and they blame technology solely for societal ills. So that's something that I take issue with a little bit. There's many, many reasons that adolescents may be dealing with mental health issues. Crumbling democratic system, capitalism, there's many things that we could point to. So just by pointing to technology, it sort of allows us to not have to address other kinds of societal issues, right? Like inequalities and so forth. In addition, the problem here is that we're conceptualizing technology as if it's this external thing that is doing something to us. So that's the technological determinism. I don't know how many people saw the documentary on Netflix called The Social Dilemma. If you remember, that documentary is also widely popular, widely shared. The main storyline depicted the central adolescent character as a programmable automaton. It was like a marionette at the mercy of social media platforms. The idea was that social media was like implanting thoughts into young people's brains, controlling their behaviors. And this is really dangerous because if we send the message that adolescents don't have agency, or they don't have choice, or they don't have ability to, control their behaviors, that they're getting taken over by technology, we're actually robbing adolescents from the ability to think about how they want to use social media. These kinds of techno-panic narratives also really ignore many of the ways in which adolescents get a lot out of social media use, especially if we're thinking about, I'll talk a little bit about some of this research, LGBTQ adolescents who are often using social media to find connections to communities that might not be available in their physical environments. So so we take, in my culture and technology lab, we take a critical cultural perspective on these techno-panic narratives and try to bring culture more into the conversation, culture and context more into the conversation, and think about adolescents not as automatons that are being programmed, but as having thoughts and plans and making decisions, having goals and purposes for why they use social media. There's also a lot of research. This is just a quick review of some studies that are out there. While there's a lot of these techno-panics that are happening in mainstream media, In the research, the literature finds that the concerns about the effects of social media on adolescents are often disproportional to the evidence. We actually don't have a lot of, when we compile all of, this is a review of the research, when we compile the research, there's not a lot of evidence that social media is harmful for adolescents' health. What we do see is this differential susceptibility to media effects. We're seeing more and more evidence that the effects of social media are person-specific, based on individual uses, individual susceptibilities, which makes perfect sense. So the outcomes of social media depends on how you use it. And so that's really what we're trying to get at in my culture and technology lab. We're taking more of a transactional view or a reciprocal understanding social media more as a cultural tool for adolescents' identity development. So it's a more transactional circular process that we bring our lived experiences, our intersectional identities to the table when we use social media, and our identity will then drive or motivate the kinds of social media that we use, the way that we use social media, who we interact with social media, how we interpret and make meaning of our experiences. So digital media can transform our identities, but we use it as a tool to interact with our world, to make, to find relationships, to maintain relationships, to find information, to inform our identity development. So the media practice model is one really famous theory that has this kind of transactional kind of approach to understanding identity development with social media. So the idea is that our identities that are forming in our cultural contexts and our everyday lived experiences with our families and our peers and our neighborhoods and our schools, those identities inform, motivate us to use social media or to select certain platforms in particular ways. It also shapes the way that we attend to the social media content that we're interacting with. It informs how we interact with others using social media. And all of this process, our identity is also informing how we interpret our interactions with social media, and then how we're going to apply those experiences to our further identity development, right? So identity is constantly evolving, it's dynamic, it's not static. So when we encounter new information or new experiences, we can either incorporate that into our understanding of ourselves, our schemas, our understanding of ourselves, or we can resist it or reject some information or experiences that we have from being consolidated into our identity. So this is the media practice model. This arrow here also suggests that sort of another dimension to the model is not only are we using social media to inform our identity development, but we're also using social media to engage in public discourse, which is something that's really new for Generation Z adolescents. Before social media, there wasn't a lot of opportunities for teenagers to participate in public conversation, to participate in the discourse that's happening, say, on Twitter or Instagram or other places. And now the kinds of conversations that we're having or adolescents are having can happen in what's called networked publics. So online social networks that are publicly available. So we can express our views, we can express our opinions, we can express our identities. And not only will it be circulated amongst our close friends, but it can also be circulated more widely and perhaps change public opinion or change our understanding of what's normative. So we have this arrow here also that suggests that in this model, as we use social media, adolescents are also contributing to cultural changes and cultural continuities and beliefs and values, narratives, and so forth. I don't know if I should check out the chat here. Okay, we got some chat. Great. Okay. Okay, so we're all on board so far. So what I would like to do is just show you some recent studies that we published out of our lab, and then I'm going to show you some recent ongoing work, and also try to add in sort of how undergraduate research assistants have participated in this research. So this is some recently published research I'm excited to share. I have this QR code if you want to look up the actual paper. I think that should be able to work. This is my first time using QR codes for research publications, but this is an open access paper about gender ideologies and how they shape adolescent social media use. So our research question here was, my graduate students and I had noticed that there's a lot of conversation about gender differences in social media use. Girls use social media in this way and boys use social media in that way. So for example, girls are more likely to use social media to self-objectify or to, post attractive photos of themselves and generate positive affirmations about their physical appearances. Whereas boys were more likely to use gaming, for example, to use social media in a way that might be involving like competitive activities. And so we wanted to sort of interrogate this gender difference. Where does this gender difference come from? Is it just that boys and girls are two binary different kinds of species? Men are from Mars, women are from Venus? Or might it be the kinds of cultural beliefs and values, gender ideologies that have shaped adolescents' identity? Might it be motivating them to use social media in different ways, in these gender binary ways? So our idea here was, again, to bring the cultural perspective to social media. Instead of just thinking about social media having some kind of unidirectional effect on adolescents, we thought, let's try to understand why adolescents might be motivated to use social media in these gendered ways. Could it be because they're internalizing or identifying with traditional gender ideologies? So we're looking at sort of this half of this model. How does identity, and particularly adolescents' identification with traditional gender ideologies, how does that shape their motivations, their selection of certain platforms, their attention, and their interactions? And we got at this by looking at the purposes of their social media use. Okay, so what we did is we collected surveys. We had some undergraduate research assistants helping us here at a local high school. We went to these local high schools and undergraduates helped us out with this. And we distributed paper and pencil surveys, actually. And they filled out a number of different questions. These were all cisgender adolescents, I should be clear here. So their sex at birth matched their current gender identity. And we asked them about their social media use, what kinds of platforms they're using, their top 3 social media platforms. And then we asked them about their purposes of social media use. We asked them, what are the main goals or purposes? So we're kind of getting at this interaction and attention. So here's some findings that we had. So first of all, in terms of selection, when we're looking at platform selection, we actually saw a lot of gender similarities. This data were collected right before the pandemic. So this is 2019. So TikTok was just about to start to take off. So we're going backwards in time a little bit here. But both boys and girls were pretty much equally using Instagram and Snapchat. These were the top platforms at the time. And girls were sort of leading the way for TikTok. Girls are more likely to be on TikTok. 66% of our sample of girls were using TikTok as in their top 3 platforms. Boys at this time were more likely to be using Discord and Reddit, and girls were slightly more likely to be using Tumblr, but only about 4% of the girls in our sample were using Tumblr. So this was their selection. And then we wondered, do gender ideologies, their identification with gender ideologies shaping their selection of platforms? We actually didn't find very much evidence of that, except one significant finding. We found that the more that girls identified with masculinity ideology, the more likely they were to be using Reddit. So here's where we start to see how gender ideologies are not just men identify with masculinity and girls identify with femininity. We actually distributed masculinity and femininity scales to both girls and boys, so we could assess whether girls were also identifying with masculinity ideology or whether boys were identifying with femininity ideology. I should probably define this for you, what masculinity ideology is. Masculinity ideology is beliefs and values about invulnerability and independence in relationships. So preserving one's sense of independence, always maybe doing a little bit of, separating oneself from being vulnerable. Whereas femininity ideology is all about it's oftentimes emphasizing other people's needs above your own, really valuing connection and really valuing being accepted by others. So oftentimes self-silencing is part of femininity ideology, and these are traditional gender ideologies. which might be less relevant to Gen Z adolescents, which I'll get to in a minute. So the next question we had was about the purposes of their social media use. So we asked adolescents across all your top 3 platforms, what are your main goals for social media use? And we asked them about purposes of social media use that have been well researched in the literature. So we looked at emotion bonding and appearance validation. We also looked at this idea of competitive activity bonding. So like gaming, using competitive activities to bond with your friends. And we did find that girls were more likely to report using social media for the purposes of emotional disclosure, for feeling closer to their close friends. Girls were also more likely to report using social media for appearance validation, to post, attractive photos and get attention for attractive photos. And boys were more likely to use social media for competitive activity bonding. So I should say that we should also be careful here. So when I say there's a gender difference, it doesn't mean that all girls did use social media in one way and all boys use social media another way. There was a lot of overlap. There was certainly a lot of boys that were also using social media for appearance validation and for emotion bonding. It's just that the mean differences, the average differences, swung in this gendered direction. And then our goal was to understand, well, does femininity ideology help to explain why girls are using social media more for emotion bonding and appearance validation? Because they're identifying with this traditional gender ideology. We found that whereas girls were more likely to identify with femininity ideology, there was no gender difference in their identification with masculinity ideology. And this confirms research over the past 15, 20 years, where we're starting to see a shift where girls are starting to incorporate beliefs and values and relationships that have been traditionally associated with men. So in other words, you can think about, if a little girl is playing with a toy truck, she might be more likely to be valued and rewarded. But if a little boy is playing with a doll, he might be more likely to be stigmatized or chastised. So we're seeing this broad cultural trend in the United States over the past, about 15 years. Towards this girls, being rewarded more for incorporating more masculine characteristics and beliefs and values. And that's what we found in our study as well. And then what we found in terms of associations with social media is that femininity, as we predicted, did help to explain why girls were using, this was a regression model using some statistics. Femininity ideology did help predict why girls were using social media more for emotion bonding and appearance validation, but it also predicted competitive activity bonding. And masculinity ideology predicted both appearance validation and competitive activity bonding. So what we think might be happening here is we tend to think of, like, when girls are posting these, photos of themselves, we tend to see girls as victims. We tend to see them, we might interpret girls as, well, they're insecure and they need validation as a way to feel good about themselves. But I think what we're seeing here with masculinity ideology is what's motivating girls and boys to engage in appearance validation is that it's also a way to be assertive in their sexuality. It's sort of a way for young women to engage in sexual self-objectification, not just to perform for men, but to inhabit their sexual expression like men assertively. So it might be a way for adolescents to actually gain power in their relationships. So masculinity ideology is all about valuing power and invulnerability in relationships. And so perhaps the more that girls identify and boys identify with this kind of value for relationship, power, and lack of invulnerability, the competition and so forth, the more they may be using social media to gain more power, to gain more status in their communities, especially in their peer environments. And then for competitive activity bonding, I think we underestimate how, femininity ideology is beliefs, values, expectations for being likable and accommodating in relationships. We normally associate it with emotion bonding, but it's also maybe associated or motivating other kinds of bonding that is involving activities and competitive games as well. And then I want to mention here, one of the things that we found in the study was that the femininity ideology scales and the masculinity ideology scales, they didn't hang together very well as a construct. So we're finding some evidence that today's even cisgender adolescents don't really identify with traditional femininity and masculinity the way that adolescents maybe 10, 15 years ago might have identified. So for example, a critical component of femininity ideology is this idea of like self-silencing. And we found that that item didn't work at all. And self-silencing, being, you know, submissive and not saying anything, might be very much less relevant to the idea of femininity in today's adolescents compared to the past. And so this brings us to the next study where we're thinking about adolescents. So this is a study number 2. This study was specifically with LGBTQ adolescents, and we wanted to understand how adolescents who might be sort of at the frontiers of new ways of thinking about gender and sexuality, who maybe their interactions on social media may be changing dominant narratives, beliefs, and values for gender and sexuality. So in this study here, this is a QR code for that article as well. This was led by a graduate student from the social area, Logan Barsegian, and Cyrus Howard, who is actually one of our advisors, who's become part of our department now. And yeah, so the research question here was, how do LGBTQ adolescents use social media to construct their gender and sexual identities? And we looked at it more holistically. So we're thinking about all aspects of this model. Yeah, so to do so, to understand sort of more holistically how LGBTQ adolescents are using social media, we did this very unique kind of qualitative method that really put the perspectives of adolescents at the forefront. So this is a social media tour, and this is a recreation, some research assistants from a few years ago now that recreated what it looked like, what the social media tours looked like. So these were, we conducted interviews with 20 LGBTQ adolescents in the local community. And this is also done before COVID. And we essentially asked them to give us a tour of their top 3 social media profiles. So this is a photo recreation. We asked them to sort of plug in their phone to our computer so that we could record the screen as they scrolled through their phone. And we could also record their interpretations, what they were saying about their experiences on social media. So we interviewed them about their public posts. We had to focus just on their public posts because of privacy issues. So we asked them to give us a tour, to walk us through how they use their top 3 social media platforms, and the different kinds of interactions that they've had, and how they interpreted their experiences and how they integrated it into their identity development. So this way we could follow along visually. We could see what they're actually doing online rather than just what they're reporting in a survey. And then we could also have them interpreting and help us to understand what was going on. So each interview was about 2 to 3 hours long. It yielded incredibly rich data about adolescents' lived experiences with social media and their meaning making with social media. So I'll give you a little bit of a sense of the findings here. Basically, we did thematic analysis, and here undergraduate research assistants, Cyrus Howard and Karen Quintero were super involved, and they were so involved that they actually became authors on the study. So in my lab, if undergraduate research assistants are really contributing conceptually to the study, so not just entering data or collecting data, but contributing conceptually to the results and to the analyses or to the writing, then we make sure that they also become authors on the papers. So this is a really great example of 2 undergraduates who worked very closely with Logan to analyze the data. And they did this kind of inductive, like from the ground up thematic analysis, where you're watching these interviews over and over again to figure out, like, what are some themes that are coming up about how adolescents are using social media to construct their identities. And they found evidence for 3 main themes. Navigation strategies. We can think of them as interaction strategies or navigation strategies that they used with social media to construct their identities. So they were making choices about visibility and permanence, who's going to see their posts. Are they going to delete posts from an old identity before they've changed and transformed their identity? Or are they going to keep that up? They were also using social media to create queer community, find connections with other LGBTQ adolescents, but and finding new ways to kind of speak back to the common stigmatizing narrative that's often seen with minoritized adolescents in general. So we found, for example, one way that they created queer community was through joy, through expressions of joy and celebration. And then the third strategy was seeking and sharing information, right? So seeking out information about what might my identity be in terms of my sexuality or my gender or my romantic identity, and new language and labels that are emerging. And also sharing information with other LGBTQ youth, but also sharing information with the broader public to raise awareness around, say, for example, transgender identity. But we also found, when we found these themes, that we really couldn't extricate these themes and how they played out from three major contexts, three navigational contexts. And those three navigational contexts was the traditional gender narrative. So even LGBTQ youth, we're still kind of like speaking back to major narratives, so dominant, traditional gender narratives. And so that was still kind of the dominant context that they had to make meaning of their own identities in relation to these longstanding narratives for a gender binary and traditional male and masculinity and femininity. We also found that we couldn't really divorce these navigation strategies from the platform itself, that it varied tremendously depending on what platform they were. So we call these platform affordances. So what are the affordances are about? What are the opportunities for action? So Twitter, for example, has different kinds of opportunities for action compared to Tumblr and compared to Instagram, where Instagram is primarily visual and Tumblr has a higher, more of a robust queer community. And then we also realized that we couldn't divorce it from the white liberal community context that we're living, that our participants are all from Santa Cruz. It's a very much, a liberal community context and also primarily white. We did have some diversity in our sample, but not a lot. It was primarily white and Latinx. And these intersectional identities also shaped the way adolescents were constructing their identities on social media. So it was very contextual. And I'll just give you a sense of some of the some of the quotes that came out of the study. So this is these series of quotes. It's from one participant, cisgender female. She was 19. She identified as bisexual, and she was biracial as well. And these series of quotes gives you a sense of how she was negotiating her gender and sexuality differently across different platforms. So the first quote is a quote that came out of her tour when she was on Instagram. The second one is coming out of her Tumblr tour. And the third one is coming out of when she was showing us her Twitter. So on Instagram, she was more likely to be encountering the traditional gender narrative. She talked about feeling this pressure to portray herself in a bikini pic, right? It's summertime, people are expecting bikini pics from women. But she was also resisting that traditional gender narrative. She's like, these things these are things that I don't necessarily put on my Instagram. The photo that she was describing, I'm not able to show you the visual because of privacy issues, but the photo that she was sharing was, she wasn't like posing in a traditional gender way. She was kind of in a store and a little bit messy. And so she was resisting the traditional gender narrative in some way. On Tumblr, her construction of her gender identity was very different. She was thinking about her sexuality in terms of her bisexual label. And so she was engaging in really complex, sophisticated kinds of discourses with other LGBTQ youth about, what does it mean to be bi? Is it inherently a gender binary, or can you say that bi means more than just being attracted to cisgender men and women? So she was engaging in really complex conversations about her sexuality, exploring and defining herself. And then on Twitter, she talked about, here's me being like a little gay, and she's posting about Brie Larson. All the queer women are all about her right now. These are gay moments that you have to read into. So on Twitter, she was like connecting with queer community, but managing her visibility a little bit too, right? Kind of encoded language. Here's me being a little bit gay, so not being super explicit. You have to be in the know. You have to be really connected to queer community to understand what she's describing. So if you're interested in more, I know we're kind of running out of time a little bit, but check out this paper. It's a really rich qualitative study that gives you a sense of what adolescents are contending with, what LGBTQ adolescents are contending with online and constructing their gender and sexual identities. And just to give you a little bit taste of some new research that Zach and Karina are doing, and my newest graduate students in the lab. Zach is looking at these social media tours and trying to understand how family might be influencing how LGBTQ adolescents are constructing their identity. So again, we're looking at this holistic model, reanalyzing the same digital tours. These digital tours were so rich that we wanted to reanalyze them again and think about family and how family might be shaping the strategies that they're using to construct their identities. This is also another undergraduate research assistant, Gabby Garcia, who's participated and has contributed significantly and is going to be an author on the study as well. Let's give you a little bit of a taste. We're still in the preparation mode for this study. But one of the things that we did is we analyzed these interviews from a family systems perspective. So we created these maps in order to depict the structure of the family relationships that was happening. So just from their interviews, we constructed their maps. And there's rings, colors, and the border all represent something different. So the rings, the closer that the family member is to the participant, the closer they are to them emotionally, and if they trust them more, they feel like there's more of a connection. And the farther they are away from the individual in the middle, the more distance that they experience. So we just used this map to interpret what adolescents were telling us when they kind of spontaneously mentioned family members in their interviews. And then the colors represents the valence of the relationship. So like, was it positive? Green is positive, red was negative, and blue was transformative. And then we used the border was the degree of outness. So if they weren't out to them at all, it was a dark ring. So for example, they didn't feel very close to their aunt. They mostly just interacted with them on Facebook. They weren't out to them. They had sort of a negative relationship with this aunt. Whereas there was kind of some level of outness with this aunt, and they were out to their mother, and there's no border there. And so we spent a lot of time constructing these maps, figuring them out, and we placed them on two intersecting dimensions that represent the quality of the relationship with their parents. So distance versus closeness, how close versus distant do you feel? But also pressure versus volition, right? So these are two important dimensions that previous research has found in terms of adolescents' relationships with their parents. So you can be really close to your parent, but you might feel a lot of pressure. So this is often the case with sometimes with cultural minority youth, with Latinx youth, or sometimes with Asian youth, where they feel very close to their family, but they also feel a lot of family obligation and maybe some pressure. Whereas with American youth, there might be closeness, but more granting for autonomy or volition. Volition means autonomy and agency, self-determination. You could also combine distance with volition. That can be positive too, if we're thinking about older adolescents as they become more and more independent. Distance and pressure is usually a pretty negative relationship, like the combination of not feeling close to your parents, but also having a lot of pressure. This is often a kind of a negative quadrant in terms of adolescent parent relationships. So we spent a lot of time and we put these participants in these different quadrants, and our general findings that we're still writing up is that we found that depending on what quadrant they were in, if they experienced lots of, it sort of shaped how they use social media to construct their identity. So if they had lots of volition, if they had lots of self-determination and choice and personal freedom and closeness with their parents, they tended to use social media pretty minimally to inform their identity. The idea is that they were already getting a lot of rich opportunities offline, either from their family and friends, right? Because they had a lot of opportunities to express themselves, express their choices. Whereas if they felt distance from their parents, their family, I should say, and pressure, then they were much more likely to be using social media, not only to inform their identity and kind of figure out who they are, but also for community connection. In the quadrant here, when they felt pressure and emotional closeness with family, they tended to use social media more for identity, and that makes sense, right? So they don't need community, they have community, they feel close to their family, but there's a lot of pressure, not a lot of opportunity to explore. So they're more likely to be using social media to explore and figure out who they are. And then at the opposite end, right, the more that there was emotional distance, but lots of determination, they kind of knew their identity, but they needed social media for community. So we're currently writing up those data. And then the last study I'll talk about today is Karina's recent work. She's looking at Gen Z and their civic engagement on social media, and she's testing whether social media participation is activism or slacktivism. So this was a survey that we distributed to the psychology pool and to a national sample. Participants were asked to report how much they had posted about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter in 2020. So we asked them to open up their top social media platforms, top 2. And yeah, I can definitely provide access to these slides, no problem. So we asked them to go back on their timelines in 2020 and upload screenshots of all of their posts. And then they answered questions about their current critical consciousness and system justification. So critical consciousness is comprised of 3 components. Do you understand that there is inequality in our society? Do you recognize inequalities? Do you have egalitarian attitudes? Do you believe that we should try to change this and make it more just and equal? And then are you actually participating in some critical action, participating in a political party, club, or organization? So this is, has been studied more and more around adolescent civic identity development, their critical consciousness. So they understand what's happening at the level of society and then participating in that change. System justification is the opposite. It's sort of the degree to which you perceive the current system as fair and functioning, right? So some of the items on this scale, like how much do you agree with these items? If people work hard, they almost always get what they want. So this is the idea that everything's fine, the system is working as it is, and if there's any differences, it's because people are lazy, right? This idea that sort of stigmatizing language. If people are poor, then it's their fault, blaming the individual rather than looking at the social structures that are in place that are inequitable. So we asked them to report on these things, and here are general findings that we're also writing up right now. Major findings. So we actually found, rather than there's this idea that young people who are posting online are just, it's slacktivism, it doesn't really amount to much. But we actually found that those who were posting more in support of Black Lives Matter in 2020 had greater critical action in 22, even after we controlled for differences in like political identification. We controlled for gender as well in the regression models. And then it was especially important, we asked them about how many debates were in the comments section. So those who had lots of debates, who had posted a lot during 2020, and then were also getting a lot of comments and debates, were much higher on critical action. So it did seem to spur them or motivate them to participate more for social change. On the other hand, we actually didn't find any associations amongst young people posting in support of All Lives Matter in 2020. It wasn't associated with system justification in 2022, even after controlling for, conservative political identification. So it might just be that young people, emerging adults, are doing less of posting about All Lives Matter, or maybe there's more transformation that have occurred. We're not sure why we found this insignificant finding. And so last but not least, we wanted to give you a sense of what some of the undergraduate research assistants saying about participating in the CAT lab. So these are our current undergraduate research assistants. Jackie is working with Karina on this critical consciousness study. She talks about really, getting to, what research looks like. Karina's a super supportive mentor. They're getting to read the literature about critical consciousness, and they're also coding some qualitative research as well that Karina is collecting. This is Sierra, who also works with Karina. So she's been involved in analyzing some of the statistical results from these Qualtrics surveys. This is another study that they're looking at themes. It's a digital literacy task. Sierra thinks that she's learning a lot about research and opportunity to work with people that you really get along with. And we're definitely very accommodating to people's different schedules. We really try to work with you so that you can participate fully and combine it with other things that are going on in your lives. So that's Jackie and Sierra. And then Natalie also works with Karina. She's learning about new software such as Qualtrics. We use Zotero. Zotero we use to organize all of our research articles. And yeah, Karina's a very supportive mentor. And then Gabby is working with Zach and has really found it to be rewarding and has been doing more qualitative research, working with Zach. Yeah, Gabby's been involved in recruiting and interviewing participants, exploring theory and reading about past research. She also feels like she's really participating a lot as a queer person of color and really helping us to be reflexive and thinking about our own biases as white researchers. So she's been really instrumental to bringing more of an intersectional perspective to this research. And yeah, they're a great group. I love working with them. They love being part of the lab. And that's all I have for you today. Check out the website. And thanks so much for listening, everybody.
Thank you so much, Professor Manago. And we're going to be sharing our presentation in a little while. Just give us 1 second.
Okay.
Okay, so before we open it up to all of you for questions, we have prepared a few of our own for Professor Manago. So if you all are starting to brainstorm any questions of your own, feel free to begin putting them in the chat or hang on to them for later. For the first question we have for you, Professor Manago, what advice would you give to someone who is unsure if they are qualified to apply for research?
Yeah, so you don't need much qualifications. It's nice if you've taken research methods, but sometimes I've recruited students even before they've taken research methods. Especially, I think the most important thing you can do in terms of feeling qualified is just understanding what's going on in the lab. So you should look up the faculty, their website, and make sure maybe even read their, a recently published paper, just so you have a sense of, do they do experimental work? Do they do qualitative work? Is it, are they out in the community? Or are they collecting data with college? To just give you a sense of what kinds of research that they're doing. And then I would just, email that professor, say, I saw your recent research. I read this recent paper. I really like what you're doing. I'm interested. Is there a space for me? I would just reach out to them and email them. And then oftentimes I recruit students for my classes. So I can tell they get really into, the gender segment of the lecture or something. And I say, oh, okay, they have a similar interest as me. And so I'll oftentimes invite students from Psych 10. I teach Intro to Developmental Psychology. And that's a great way to get involved.
Okay, thank you. And for our last question, what is your favorite part of research?
Honestly, it sounds maybe cliche, but I love working with students. I love seeing students. Y'all just energize me when you get excited about a new research question or excited about a new kind of curiosity or something that we don't know yet. Mentoring students on their own research, like graduate students and undergraduates, is my favorite part. Yeah.
Okay, moving on. We will now be opening it up for any of you guys to ask any questions for Professor Manago. Feel free to raise your hand or type in the chat.
I talked about a lot of different studies, a lot of data. Hopefully it was clear.
Okay, while we wait for someone to ask a question, I did have one question for you.
Okay.
What drew you into specialize in how communication technologies are incorporated in diversity, social and psychological development?
Yeah, great question. I was originally, I would say when I was becoming a feminist, I had raising feminist consciousness. I was interested in gender and social constrictions of gender. I had seen so many people kind of men are like this and women are like that. And I'm like, no, it's cultural, it's socialized. How can we understand this? So when I was looking for PhD programs, I found somebody who was doing research in Chiapas, Mexico. And she was studying cultural change. There was like drastic cultural changes that were happening in this Maya community because of globalization and market economy, and a new high school had just entered into the community. So I thought, what better way to understand how gender is socially constructed, but then to see it change over time, right? If we see it change over historical time, then we see, oh, okay, you know, femininity didn't always mean this, or femininity means different things in different cultures. It's malleable. We can shape it. So I started studying changes in gender identity development in this Maya community. This was 2006. And at the time, MySpace had just come on the scene, and it was, you know, everybody was using MySpace. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. So high school is a motor for change in Chiapas. It was changing, you know, traditional gender segregation and changing career identity development in Chiapas. I thought, well, how is MySpace changing gender expression here in the United States? So that's how I started studying social media. And I continue to study cultural changes in Chiapas now that they're using social media as well. And so we're seeing more and more values, for example, for self-expression and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you for that. So if anybody else has a question, feel free to drop it in the chat or raise your hand.
I see a question about like research assistants every quarter. We tend to try to bring research assistants in that will stay for at least a year. So usually we're recruiting like once a year. Because the longer that you stay in the lab, the more likely you're going to be, you know, you're going to have more knowledge and you'll be able to contribute more, and then maybe, you know, be an author on a paper. So we're done recruiting this year, and I don't know, I think I'm going on sabbatical next year, so we might not be recruiting next year either. Yeah, but if you are interested, let me know, and we can see what's going on. And then can we be a lab assistant for 1 or 2 quarters? Some labs allow you to come in just for a quarter. Definitely, you know, maybe do some exploring. There's also the 194 postings, the 194 research credit postings outside the psychology office. So you can see, oh yeah, and then, yeah, Cyrus posted a link to who's recruiting now. So yeah, some people you can just volunteer for a quarter. Yeah. Oh, there you go. Yeah. Get some research opportunities.
We have one more question. Can you talk about the skills that your lab values?
Yeah.
This student says, I'm a first-year student, but I'm curious about research.
Yeah. In my lab, what we really value is people who actually have some experience with social media and who are curious and who are able to like reflect on their own intersectional identity. So we do a lot of work thinking about, we're starting to, I should say, you know, thinking about how things are different, that it depends, like how you use social media, what motivates you is going to depend not just on your gender identity, but your racial identity, and maybe also, you know, your sexual identity, all of the different intersections, social class. So I would say just being curious, somebody who's curious, who's experienced a little bit with social media, who's willing to reflect on their own identities and think about culture, who has some, you know, cross-cultural experiences, speaking a different language, who understands that there's cultural differences and groups, that all of that is really great. And then, yeah, just being able to read research articles and help us, you know, a little bit of SPSS, but we can teach you a lot of those things. A lot of things you can learn. It's really being curious and open to learning. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if anybody has any more questions, feel free to ask them. We have time for like one more. Okay. Well, I just wanted to remind everybody that if you are interested in starting your journey in research or furthering it, we do post opportunities in the bulletin board on the 2nd floor of Social Sciences 2. And we also post on our link, and the link is on the bottom, and they get updated every quarter to see what kind of opportunities are being available. But besides that, thank you once again to Professor Adriana Manago for the wisdom and insight she has shared with us today. Hopefully you all have a better idea what to expect out of research and can even see yourselves as future researchers one day. Thank you guys for coming. Stay safe.
Yeah, stay safe out there. Thanks, everybody.